We have two great speakers today with us. Aleksander Śniegocki from Öko-Institut. He is the founder and the director of Öko-Institut. It's a Polish independent think tank, very influential, and this think tank and the works of the colleagues in this think tank is focusing on supporting the improvement of public policy-making process in Poland, in Europe, and globally. And he will present today the study of the ETS1 revenues use and the lesson learned we can extract from that for the new emission trading system for building and sector, so-called ETS2. And our second speaker today is Viktoria Noka, Energy and Climate Senior Researcher at Öko-Institut. Öko-Institut is an independent research institute focusing on many very important topics, but especially also on socially just energy transition. So we are very happy to have you both here. So thank you very much for finding time for that. And some housekeeping rules for all our participants. In case you would like to address some questions or have some remark, please use the chat options for the Q&A session and also for the later debate. My colleague Cornelia von Niedering from Germanwatch, she will pick up your questions and address them towards our speaker. And I think without further ado, I have a pleasure to pass the floor to Aleksander Śniegocki and invite him to present their study, which they prepared as a part of our Life Effect project, which is co-funded by the EU Life and German Federal Environmental Foundation. Thank you, Aleksander.
Yes. Thank you for the introduction, Sylvia, and pleasure to be here today and pleasure to have an opportunity to support the project and the public debate in Europe around ETS and ETS2 revenues with our assessment. So I will present first a brief overview of the context and then the summary of 5 case studies. There was quite a lot of national details, so I would encourage you to check the full report. I will focus on highlights and overall insights and recommendations for national member states and European Union. A bit of a context, I think that for most of the audience, I don't need to introduce the ETS emission trading system. It's with us for I think more than 20 years already, and it has covered key economic sectors, power sector, heavy industries, now expanding to maritime, transport, aviation, and it has evolved over time with moving towards more of away from free allocations towards auctions, towards greater use of revenues for support of innovation, and also expanding the scope with soon to be launched ETS2. So in that context, we wanted to look at spending patterns up to date when it comes to ETS1. So we are looking at the orange part of this graph. So as you can see, especially during phase 3, we have moved to auctioning as a default way of allocating emissions to the power sector. This has also been kind of uneven volumes of auction revenues, also because of market stability reserve, front loading. And recently, we have also started increasing allowance use for European level instruments, which are afterwards channeled back to member states. But still the key part of auctioned allowances go directly to the member states. And so the governance and reporting of the revenues still falls to the national governments. And for ETS2, upcoming ETS2, it will also be the case without free allocation and only around a quarter of revenues going to social climate fund, rest of it going once again directly to the member states. So it's even more important to look at the national spending in the new system. We have seen recently, in recent years, during the recent ETS directive revision, there were several important changes, especially increased requirements to spend the 100% of member states' auction revenues to support climate and related objectives. There's also option to use up to 25% of its revenues to support energy-intensive industries, or rather to have an indirect carbon cost compensation as motivated by the carbon leakage concerns. It's also possible to allocate more than 25% of this limit, but then you need to report additional information to the Commission. And on the governance side of things, there was also more structure introduced to the reporting, to the spending categories, and those categories have been expanded. So in principle, we should expect that this picture, based on the historic reported spending of auction revenues, to change after 2022, to cover 100% and to be better structured and more complete, also ahead of ETS2. But as we have seen already from the initial review, this is still not the case. So even despite despite new changes in the directive, still the member states do not report all of use of auction revenues, even if we account for the possibility to direct part of them as a state aid for direct carbon costs. And the situation hasn't structurally changed compared to the previous years. And what is more important, and why you can ask, why have we repeated the classification, the assessment done by the Commission in this study? A closer look at what is being reported and how it's being reported by the member states shows that there's, in many cases, quite significant discrepancies. Even if you look at how the investments can be classified. So one example, for instance, Germany in 2023, you can see that the reported, it has included only several very aggregated types of categories. But then if you look at what's actually there, and I will discuss this in a minute, you can see that actual types of programs which are described in the reporting are not always the same as this broad categories self-assigned by the member states. And to be clear, it's not only this 1 year for Germany, it's also for other countries. So there is much more to be seen compared to what you can read in the summary report from the Commissions. So the aim of the study was to look at 5 member states with the highest emissions and revenues from the system, to understand how they spend their ETS revenues, not only what they declare, but also what are the governance structures which actually ensure that there will be additionality or direction of these funds. We wanted to understand if there are actually earmarking mechanisms, is there a visibility and transparency of spending, which is also, once again, to repeat, key thing in the context of upcoming ETS2 system and social climate fund, because the governments will receive a new portion of money which they have to govern and spend in a transparent and effective manner. And despite the new funds, it's also still useful to think about how we can increase the efficiency of spending ETS1 revenues. And as you can see, the 5 countries are responsible for around 2/3 of allowances emission revenues. So we cover quite a significant chunk of overall system. And a bit more on an approach. So we looked both at what was reported by and additional national sources which have described how the ETS revenues are used. We have focused in depth on the 5 most recent years. In case of some countries, you have a very long list of investments, including very limited, which do not account for much. So we have focused on these instruments which are significant financially, which allows us to cover over 97% of all the reporting spending over this period. So once again, this is a good overview of 5 country spending in itself, also amounting to a significant chunk of overall ETS spending. So the big picture, with an important caveat that this is adjusted for Germany over reporting. So we have adjusted this to keep the structure of ETS revenues reporting from Germany so that it does not exceed 100% of what they get from ETS. But the big picture is that overall the spending patterns are consistent and they focus mostly on building, transport, and various parts of clean power transition, with also significant parts still going to clean industrial transition and renewable research and development. There was one significant program focused on fossil fuel use directly, which I will also mention in a minute. But mostly, if we have fossil fuel subsidies, they are embedded, they are part of broader programs rather than very core element. Although I would note that we have 2 ongoing support measures, operational support measures. One is carbon leakage protection. So mostly this is about indirect carbon costs compensation. And we have electricity use subsidies, which typically take the form of funding the legacy costs of renewable support, like feed-in tariffs from the budget instead of from the tariffs. So this is effectively supporting electricity consumption, which is both support for electrification, but also it doesn't differentiate between different sources of power. So we have classified it as a separate thing. And as you can see, the picture for overall 5 countries seems very clear and structured. But if you look at different countries, you can see that there are significant differences between them when it comes to spending. So for Germany, for instance, building renovation and electricity use subsidy are the key elements. In Poland, public transport actually is reported as number 1 priority. In Spain, you have multi-purpose program mostly focused on power sector, which dominates the spending. In Italy, we have actually not found a consistent pattern because it shifts over the years. And in France, it used to be mostly building renovation programs, but after recent changes to the directive requiring 100%, there's increased use also either directed to the budget with note that this is for other purposes or for public transport. So once again, to highlight that when we were looking at subsidies or spending which is directly inconsistent with climate objectives, there was very limited examples of that directly, but at the same time, we have seen significant components of broader investment programs which actually do not safeguard against this fossil fuel lock-in risk. So, for instance, there's Clean Air program in Poland, which until recently has allowed support for gas installations. Earlier on, also even for new coal installations. You have similar issues with gas boiler support in renovation programs in other countries. It has been phased out only recently. And you also have examples, for instance, when it comes to mobility, when you're also supporting not only clean drivetrains, but also fossil fuel-based ones. We just use the latest norms, but still are dependent on fossil fuels. We also note that the changes in the directive have actually not brought significant changes in the spending and reporting patterns. So comparing how the countries approached the spending and reporting before and after the 100% requirement, basically, if your approach was to report up to 50% because it's required, you now report up to 100%, but you report equivalence. And as I have shown earlier, on the scale of overall European Union, you still see gaps in the reporting. And we also see that the part regarding indirect carbon leakage protection is also increasing in importance, and we also see that it also goes above the 25% of revenues with different national contexts which explain this, but still we also see that there's comparatively limited amount of money spent to actually support industrial transition instead of ongoing protection measures. At the same time, what we see is that there is something to be built to build on. So there are investments which support energy transition and that channel back this funds back to the citizens. So this can be reinforced and made a standard practice. And once again, I think that this is more mixed picture when you have some programs which support, for instance, building renovations or sustainable mobility, and at the same time, still significant chunks where you are not fully aligned with put replace principle. But this is about spending patterns. As we have dug deeper into the numbers, but also into national sources, I think it becomes even more apparent that you need to look beyond the numbers, also at the spending and reporting patterns, because once again, what you have, you can nominally report numbers, equivalents, financial equivalents based on the directive provisions, while not necessarily actually increasing your domestic spending on climate objectives. For this, to actually make sure that you use these funds directly, you need national earmarking, and we see that there are examples of governments earmarking national revenues for climate purposes. Although, for instance, we also see that there are cases where national earmarking violates the provisions about 100% revenue use, when the national earmarking is actually not consistent with what is required by directive, and then you can, for instance, just report the equivalent spending to close the gap, but you do not use actual carbon revenues to support additional climate action. When it comes to visibility of these funds, we also have found that earmarking is not always the same as visibility, because you can have earmarking as a one sentence in the national law, and then very untransparent use of these funds when it's difficult to actually assign it to specific spending. In that case, a good example would be Germany, where you have a specific dedicated fund, to which you channel several sources of carbon revenues. Although if you mix different revenues in the single fund, you also have some visibility lost because you support measures based on financing from several sources. So maybe to not going into details of each separate member states, you can see that overall there is actually earmarking more often than not, but at the same time, this national earmarking is not always consistent with what you can actually see on the national level and what is reported to the European Commission. So, for instance, when it comes to Poland, we have an example in 2022 where we have reported spending related to transport, renewable energies to the Commission, and it's possible to report financial equivalents. But at the same time, if you look at the domestic earmarking, national laws which earmark the revenues as they come in, you can actually see that the actual funds were allocated to more cross-cutting purposes like COVID support fund or electricity subsidies. And the overall overlap was actually very limited, only for ETS-related administrative tasks in our emission managing authority. And once again, paradoxically, the indirect carbon cost compensation has quite strict governance arrangement, quite transparent, but at the same time, it's also not directly reported in this year. So you have quite parallel systems, even though in Poland there actually exists quite strong governance for national funds used for your environmental protection. And also going even beyond the types of reporting, we can also see that there is inconsistency when it comes to approach which numbers are reported. So Germany reports overall spending within its dedicated climate fund, so beyond the ETS numbers. Poland or France look at meeting these requirements, 50 or 100% requirements and reporting equivalents or money which go directly to the budget. Then you have Italy, which has significant delays in spending its funds. So if you look at year by year, you can actually see a very limited amount of revenues actually utilized. So even that allows you only to limited extent to compare the countries. And once again, even when for some parts of the revenue spending you have reporting, you still have it as on an inconsistent basis. For instance, carbon leakage protection measures are not reported each year in the same type in the same manner, or you have application of official spending categories which is not consistent with what is actually there, as I have shown on a German example. It's also quite inconsistent when it comes to even language which is reported, or just mistakes when it comes to specific values and inconsistencies between different reports. So to highlight good and bad practices, starting with spending patterns, then moving to governance and reporting. So obviously good practices, there are examples when you have direct consistency and allocation of revenues with climate targets. And importantly, you also have examples already when just transition considerations are directly included in the framework of spending ETS revenues. It can be either through the types of spending. So already France, Germany, or Poland have this type of programs which support structural fight against energy poverty, also in buildings sector, which will be included in ETS2. Or you have specific earmarking for just transition goals or institutions which support just transition, like in Spain. Also you have broader approaches not only for investment in mitigation, but also investment in adaptation and innovation, which has been occurring over the years. But at the same time, you also have negative examples with misalignment with climate objectives, or even using some of the funds allocated nominally for the climate action for broader industrial policy goals. You also have still structural support, or rather, some of the revenues going into ongoing short-term subsidies rather than investments in structural measures, and still there are gaps when it comes to making sure that the fossil-dependent technologies are not supported. Maybe just to move to the recommendations or to highlight the key issues related to governance reporting. It is possible to set up dedicated funds. It is possible to have this earmarking and then evaluate and actually provide plans for spending. It's also possible to have, at least on the program level, to have also more decentralized management. But at the same time, this is something which is done on the national level. On the reporting to the European Union, we see that in many cases this is treated as a box-ticking exercise. So without this domestic political will to actually spend the money, you can still have nominally you still have nominally 100% ETS revenue use, but they are actually not flowing into support of climate transition. So recommendations for three actors or three areas of action in terms of upcoming ETS2. One issue is that it is possible and is a good practice to create a dedicated fund to manage ETS revenues, and it can be done in a way which is transparent and the reporting of these revenues is visible and clear. To do that, you also need to think about assigning the management and increase administrative capacity of relevant units or institutions which deal with these revenues. We have seen this with ETS1, and it is possible to do so with ETS2. When it comes to spending purposes, once again, we need to ensure that there is a full compliance with 100% spending obligation, which is not always the case. To focus more on structural. For ETS1, we're talking about industrial support. For ETS2, we're also talking about making sure that there is a just and fair components here. And also, we can learn from ETS1 revenues support for electricity price subsidies, good and bad examples, when thinking how the revenues can be designed to also align with broader tax and tariff system shift of burden away from electricity and towards fossil fuel use. And the final point for European institutions, this part is a bit difficult because in the end, member states have the final say in many of this process, but still it would be very useful to increase resources for European institutions to verify the reporting, to support member states in good exchanges of good practices, and also to increase pressure for reporting transparency, also limiting the way in which how often the financial equivalent clause is used by the member states. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this quite overview and a lot to digest. So thank you very much for that. Cornelia, do we have any clarification questions now directly to Alex?
Yes, there was one question in the chat. Someone wanted to know how much money these revenues actually amount to in each country, but it was already answered by Annette.
By my colleague, yes, who, yes. So there's actually obviously a teamwork, and my colleague has provided this data. And I think, yes, probably the presentation will be shared, but much more details are actually in the report, which is already available.
Yes, exactly. But for sure, we can see also how far we can share the study directly together with the presentation to the participants if that's the wish. And if the speaker is fine with that, then of course we can do that as well. And and we also put the link to the report in a second. Then if there weren't any further questions, because we will start the debate after our second speaker input, then I would like to give the floor to Viktoria Noka for a comment on the study of that what we just heard and maybe some further insights which she can share with us based on her experience in that field. Viktoria, the floor is yours.
I just saw that there was one follow-up question for Alex. I don't know if he maybe wants to take it on requirements for ETS directives for transparency.
Yes, so unfortunately there is quite limited requirements. So obviously there is a reporting requirement, also in broader, for instance, governance regulation. But as you can see, that the core requirement in the ETS directive is formulated in a way that you should use the revenues or their financial equivalent for, and then there's a long list of different elements. And then you can report on that. But once again, the reporting is also, if you have equivalents, then you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to what you report. So we have seen examples, for instance, in Poland, when you report the value of, for instance, green certificates, which is actually not paid directly by the government, but at the same time, the government will say, okay, this is the spending induced by us. So this is an equivalent. And in the end, it would be quite difficult for the Commission, for instance, to force member states to do, based on existing legal basis, something which they are not ready to do. But at the same time, once again, going back to Polish example, we are actually very close to moving to, I would say, best practices when it comes to transparency of spending funds, because there was an idea to create a dedicated national fund to spend this money, and then we would have really full transparency on the use. So in the end, this is really about domestic decisions on how to spend the funds.
There's another question in the chat, but I think Susanna was first.
But we will still ask you to put the questions in the chat because otherwise, if you will let one person to address the question here in the plenum, then we'll also have to do that to all the others. So, Suzanne, if it's time for you, then we will kindly ask you, and maybe you can just So maybe Cornelia, you can address the another question in the chat, and in the meantime, can Susanna have time to keep her question here in the chat.
Yes, I can maybe answer a couple more questions, because I see that so we haven't, like, this is beyond the study for us to assess the overall climate spending by the governments. But once again, I can provide a Polish example where we actually have some budgetary allocation or budgetary category, climate and energy, and we have seen that actual spending, like actual ETS revenues, are actually lower. Oh, sorry, actual ETS revenues are higher than our declared climate spending. But at the same time, when the reporting comes, we have started to report spending on public transport, which is not classified as climate. So once again, it's the issue is how creative you can be when reporting, when you don't have an actual decision to allocate the money. And I think the experience shows that you can be very creative, and you can say that a lot of things that you already do is in some way supporting climate action, but we don't have additionality. We don't have additional spending which accelerates climate action. So yeah, it's an issue. And then MFF and ETS. Yeah, once again, I think this was a bit out of scope, but I think that there is still a discussion about how the ETS, if part of ETS will be used to fund, to go to fund part of MFF. I think that would be a separate discussion about whether it's a good thing or not necessarily. I would just note that MFF is not spent 100% on climate, but I think it's probably for discussion for another day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aleksander, for picking up the first questions we had. Maybe you will soon be able to address this question in the debate round afterwards. Yeah, we can go back to that. And then now, yeah, I think there is no further questions. Cornelia, you can confirm that for me. Thank you. And then Victoria, now please go ahead. Thank you for waiting.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for sending the report just prior to publication, and it was great to be able to read it. I think that the upcoming implementation of the ETS2, even if it is delayed, and the prospect of these new revenues is definitely a really good starting point for us to take stock of our spending and our existing governance structures. So I think it comes at a really good time, this report, and I also want to congratulate Alex and the whole team for bringing together really diverse landscape across these 5 member states. I think anybody that will look at the report finds that it's very different in all of these countries that were studied, and no doubt many Excel sheets and documentations read to put together this report. So well done for sure. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to pick up on a few points that stood out to me, pose some questions already for our discussion, and think a little bit on governance on the one side and spending on the other side, as the report differentiates between these 2 aspects as well. So in terms of governance, maybe to start there, I mean, great to see the KTF pointed out as a good example based in Germany, and sometimes you lose perspective a little bit when you're very critical and you see some issues, and to actually notice, okay, maybe it's actually not that bad. And what I found really interesting is that the report, or what the report highlighted for me, is that we actually have a very clear kind of to-do list for member states in terms of what is needed for better governance, maybe a dedicated fund rather than putting money into the national budget, a dedicated governing body rather than trying to spread responsibilities across different ministries. And what we really want is more and more consistent reporting, more details, more traceability, more availability of data, kind of a consistency in the reporting. So I think it's quite clear what we want done and what the good practices are. What kind of came up as a question for me when reading this, and it's kind of interlaced through the report, is who are the relevant actors that we address this kind of to-do list to? Who is responsible for going through and making these kinds of changes? And on the one hand, we of course have the environmental, energy, or climate ministries that are involved in this, usually in a main role, but also the role of the Commission, I think, is important here, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because who's responsible, who the key actors are in this governance system, really also help to dictate spending patterns, right? And whether it's maybe the environmental ministry or an energy more focused ministry, or whether those are combined, really make a difference in what the governance looks like and what the spending priorities are. And I guess the question that came up as well in this context is to really think about what is the role of changing political landscapes across the EU. So how do we set up governance structures that are resilient as well? Because we want to think about how can we set this up in a way that it cannot easily be attacked or changed, or but it has a certain kind of consistency across legislative periods. And governance overall, I think, is also about enforcement. I think that's something I took away from this report as well, that if we kind of know what we have to do, so what the requirements are, 100% spending on climate and social activities, what we also need is someone to make sure that we're doing it, that we're actually doing the things that are necessary. It kind of came up in the question just now, what are the legislative requirements at the EU level? Is it a domestic issue? Is it an EU level issue? I really appreciated a section in the conclusion of this report that highlighted the kind of role that EU institutions can take in this, and I would certainly push for the capacity within the Commission to be strengthened to ensure that we have a sort of enforcement of the rules that are already there. And of course, the function of good governance is verification, right? We want to verify that the money that we have, the revenues that are coming in, are actually being spent the way that we're saying that they're spent. You know, the first step is saying that we spend it in the right way. The second step is to check whether that's actually the case. So then perhaps to shift from governance to spending at this point. I think a really good point that we shouldn't forget in this whole debate is that generally we are heading in the right direction. And I like page 54 in the report, just to quote, it was also in the presentation. In many cases, the spending is generally consistent with EU climate targets. A carefully optimistic tone, but optimistic nonetheless. So I just want us to remember as well that while there's kind of issues and with the reporting, and we could certainly do better, we are on the right path. Just before Christmas, maybe not so much bad news, but also some good news. And what I also took from the report was some really good examples of programs that are already in place, especially in the buildings renovation sector. The BEC in Germany, of course, the MaPrimeRénov' in France, the Clean Air Program in Poland. There are good examples of programs that have been in place for a couple of years that have seen kind of iterations and improvements in the way that they're targeted and how the spending works. So let's not forget that we have some good examples out there. I also want to point out a really interesting example, which is this Just Transition Institute from Spain, which helps coal-dependent regions specifically. And that's like there are some interesting examples there of how we can use the revenues. And of course, there are also some maybe not so good examples. I don't really want to get into too many details of the programs, but one interesting example was from Spain that has set up a spending limit for social policies from their ETS revenues. I think we can agree that a spending limit is not necessary, but perhaps a minimum spend would be interesting. But overall, what we see is that while we want more structure and more details in the governance, I think spending, certainly there's room for streamlining and making sure that money is actually getting out there. If I'm seeing in an extreme example from Italy, money or revenues generated in 2014 being spent in 2024, there's certainly room for improvement on how we're getting money out as well, and not just what we're spending it on. Now I want to leave enough time for a discussion with everybody here, so maybe I can just finish on three final thoughts. I think one of the things that came up for me while reading this kind of with a bit of more of a meta perspective was, how do we want to deal with spending or funding expectations in what might perhaps be a tense economic climate? So how do we motivate changes in spending patterns when money is tight and when maybe the political climate is not prioritizing tackling climate change? How do we motivate changes when money is going to general budgets, when in Italy it's going to, the fund on state bonds? How do we motivate money moving away from those things to what it should be actually used for? I think that's a significant tension within member states that we shouldn't forget. The report also kind of briefly mentions in one or two sections that better governance and kind of increasing transparency can also strengthen public acceptance for carbon pricing or even specific programs within the countries. I think I agree, but I think perhaps in the discussion we can push this a little bit and think about what else are we going to need once we have better transparency to translate that into public acceptance, because clearer program descriptions in the KTF isn't going to make my grandma complain less about her heating bill. So perhaps maybe for us just to think about what other actors we need as well to really motivate that kind of change. And finally, I work a lot on the Social Climate Fund and on energy poverty and transport poverty. And I think that the Social Climate Fund really gives us a strong signal from the EU level to prioritize vulnerable groups. It gives us a really clear direction of how to do that. But as we all know, the Social Climate Fund can't do it all, right? So perhaps also to push a little bit, I think it was not the priority in this report to think about how we can use positive momentum from what's happening along the social climate plans in each of the member states to also sharpen policy design and how ETS revenues are being used to support specific groups that are particularly vulnerable to carbon pricing. Okay. I'll stop there. Those are some questions, some points. I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria. This was already, thank you for highlighting like the most relevant points in the study from your point of view, and once again compliment to Aleksander and his team at Reform-Institut for the study. And so once again thank you for that from my side. But you also addressed already some valid questions and a lot of food for thought, I think, to discuss. Now I would like to also invite our participants to put their questions in the chat on what's your thoughts and what's your questions to the speakers. Maybe you already have some remarks to the questions which Victoria addressed. I see clearly a lot of action points for us as a Life Effect Consortium as well to use the time. I think the very important moment is also the revision of ETS directive next year. So that's definitely the point in time to come up with some recommendations for the member states and from the European Commission based on this study. So I think that would be a great base to work on that. And I also brought some questions. I mean, maybe Aleksander, I will give the floor first to you if you wish to address some of the questions or points raised by Victoria. If not, I also had already so many questions in my head to ask you. And in meantime, dear participants, please also use the time to put your chat. So Aleksander, if you wish, then go ahead first.
Yes, maybe I will add a bit more, once again, a bit beyond the study, because we have focused specifically on this topic. But I think that it would be a useful question to reflect on a broader issue of where we need to put the pressure, like this pressure on governance. I think that ETS directive, for now, it hasn't fully delivered on that part. Yes, so there was a lot of useful work done on reporting, and I would say it's still a capacity issue, and the capacity should be increased for European institutions. But in the end, we see that this is a domestic policy choices. And the open question is to what extent we can have a framework which affects domestic decisions directly. I'm not sure that direct adjustments to ETS directive in this space will be the most efficient or most effective, but I would note that you will have other areas like upcoming MFF and reform plans or European semester, so other areas where the Commission may provide some incentive, guidance, or expectation that this type of revenues, that this type of transparency and governance will be actually delivered. And the timing is indeed important because, as I mentioned with the Polish example, we're very close to allocating these new funds to like a separate fund. But if you lose this moment and the funds are already spent in the general budget, then it's very difficult to claw back and put them once again in the dedicated fund. So it will be really important to have these arrangements ahead of 2028 this time, because we have seen the delay in ETS2. And maybe a final point, we haven't discussed in the report the other revenue use, but I would note that for modernization fund or for funding the repower chapters or for innovation fund, we by definition have a 100% spending which is transparent and monitored. And for instance, for loading of ETS2, I think it also is, if we have a front loading facility, it also creates by definition this framework. So we may be a bit more creative when thinking about how to have this transparency in place as an addition to ETS directive.
Thank you very much for that. Cornelia, comment?
Yeah, there's another question in the chat about other EU countries. So, for example, Bulgaria. I know that the study is only for 5 countries, but maybe can you point where someone could find more information on other member states regarding how the revenues were spent?
I think when it comes to other countries, that would be for the consortium to answer, but I think that maybe my colleague will provide the link to the database, to the report database, and also you can find the reports in the links in the report. So we made sure to make it quite interactive, but for every source you can click and find the underlying database. So basically all the reports are available in the report net and are summarized by the Commission.
And what I can add to is that in our consortium, Life Effect, our partner, and the Green Tank from Greece, will prepare the analysis of ETS2 revenue spending next year. So there is definitely something more to come. And when it comes to the other countries, well, we don't have anything in the pipeline currently, but let's see in which direction this topic will take us next year. So never say never, or never say no also to that, so such an opportunity. So this for now, I can recommend to look into the study on ETS2 revenue next year. And what I wanted to ask in the meantime is to both of you as well, because what we heard just now from both of you is that on the one hand we need actually more transparency when it comes to reporting, maybe also like more stringent regulation, how the reporting should look like, and so on. And on the other hand, what we hear currently from the member state when it comes to the Social Climate Fund and the worries about the reporting there, that the Commission will be very strict on how the money in the Social Climate Fund is spent and how to report that to make everything right. So there is a lot of worries and the bureaucracy coming and seeing from the member states. So how actually tackle this challenge when it comes to also ETS2 revenue spending? Like, what do you think would be like to meet in the middle, so to say, from the perspective of how to use the money in an effective way and to clearly see that that's the case, and on the other hand, to consider also the concerns of the member states. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
I see that Victoria is unmuted, so maybe she has idea how to
Ladies
have an
first.
ideal governance.
Ideal governance for all EU funds. I mean, I think we can already see it in the way that the SCF or the social climate plans have worked out, but also even in the NECPs, for example, that some member states take this a bit more seriously than others. Maybe some are more detailed than others. So I think on the one hand, we will always see differences in how member state capacity to report. And that will always be the case. I mean, the idea that the Commission had is to try to align all of these activities as much as possible, NECPs, social climate plans, and I definitely see reporting for ETS revenues to be relevant there as well. But the reporting that the member states do to the EU is mostly on numbers and not really on the programs and all of these things, right? So the details of really what the revenues are being used for and on the programs that are happening a little bit somewhere else or in other national documents and structures. So I think the more the EU can give pre-use documentation to say where it's quite easy to fill out.
I think we lost Victoria for the moment, at least on my hand. So maybe
Yes, it seems.
in time, Aleksander, if you want to add something to that question, and then we can wait for Victoria to come back.
Yes, so maybe yes, I don't have an universal solution for the whole governance of all funds, but I think we can find good examples. So in the Polish case, the modernization fund actually, I think, provides a good balance or a good incentive, because we had this discussion in Poland. Do we want to have funds going to directly to the country or to send it to the modernization fund? Because we actually had this option because of Article 10C derogation, which we haven't used. It's for ETS aficionados. They would know the discussion, and in the end, it turns out that it was better for climate action to have these funds in the dedicated fund co-managed by European institution. It added bureaucratic work, but at the same time, in the end, you have clear spending on additional programs, and you have a clear discussion on efficiency of these programs also domestically. Unfortunately, when it comes to ETS revenues in Poland, or the rest of ETS revenues, we don't have this clarity. So I wouldn't be against any bureaucracy, so to say, or any requirements ahead of time, because in the end, it also ensures that you actually have this kind of transparency and you actually do spend the money on what you would like to have. You have a kind of permanent yes, you have a permanence in your decision when it comes to, we want to spend this several billions or tens of billions of euro specifically to support transition, and you will still have flexibility to discuss, as modernization fund shows, you can still adjust, it's possible to adjust the programs. I think that it also creates an incentive for domestic spending to be also more transparent. It's also a kind of benchmark for the countries. But once again, I think that this is, in the end, we will need to have a set of solutions. So reform plans with MFF, front loading, early access, which also provides you with clarity that you will spend money on climate. And maybe, just maybe, we should think also about if we have modernization fund, which ends in 2040, maybe we should think about expanding it, extending it, or if we have social climate fund, which ends in 2032, if you want to make sure that going forward you also have this quality and transparency, we also need to think about extending this approach when the funds are channeled back to the member states, but first you have some checks on that from the Commission. So money for the reforms or money for the transparency, so to say.
Thank you very much. Victoria, I just asked you directly in the chat if you are back with us. I wasn't willing to interrupt your input, but we just used the time when
Yes.
with the internet connection. So please come in once again, and then there will be like another question from the chat, which Cornelia will pick up. But first, you are allowed to end your sentence or thoughts.
Great, I'm back. Sorry about that. I think I can basically agree with almost everything that Aleksander has said. I think the main point that I was making, I was obviously talking to myself previously, was alignment between different reporting exercises and streamlining, which has helped if we have dedicated kind of governing bodies or dedicated responsibilities for these kinds of activities, and they're all bundled, then it makes it a little bit easier to do the reporting on the social climate plans, on ETS revenues, on the NECPs, all of the other funds that are being used. The more that we bundle capacities in kind of one place governing wise, the easier it is to do the reporting as well. And I think at the end of the day, what Aleksander pointed out as well, that this is a benchmark, or this should be a priority for the member states themselves, as they want to be clear in their allocation of budgets. They want to know if the money is being used effectively and efficiently. Those are all things that should be priorities anyway. So let's not make the reporting overly complicated on the EU level beyond what is absolutely necessary, and really focus on the kind of key aspects that member states will be intrinsically motivated to do themselves at the national government level. Anyway, I mean, national budgets are being allocated all kinds of ways, and they want transparency in that, and they need some sort of clarity of where money is going anyway. So let's try and use that within what the EU asks of the member states as well in terms of reporting for any of these funds.
Thank you very much.
There's a question in the chat about Czechia. So the new Czech government rejected the ETS2, probably meaning that they won't implement the legislation into the Czech legal system. So what are the legal and financial implications for the state, companies, so the private sector, and eventually citizens? For example, infringement procedures, companies operating on international markets, and the fact that in case of non-compliance, we probably won't have the social climate fund for the next 4 years, which also falls into an election period.
So this is once again, I think, a bit beyond the scope of the report or today's discussion. I can only say that we have also in Poland this type of discussion on like ETS2 implementation and what if. Maybe I will just offer a small anecdote from today, even I think. So even it turns out that Polish Ministry of Finance doesn't have spare capacity, fiscal capacity to co-fund the social climate fund, or so it says. So I think that once again, you need to also think about the revenue side and how you use it. And you basically at some point start balancing all the pros and then all the costs, which I think you mentioned in your comments. So infringement procedures, question about access to single markets, especially for the industries, and so on and so on. So I think that this would be a difficult situation for the countries which do not implement it on time.
Victoria, any thoughts on that from your side?
Yeah, I think, there's also a question of who is saying that they're not going to implement it and who's actually not going to implement it when it comes down to it. And we have all of these legal and financial implications. Is it a mechanism to build pressure on how the ETS2 will actually be implemented in terms of price caps and things like that? We already saw discussions over the summer of trying to maybe weaken the ETS2 or make some structural changes to how it would work, which was also pushed by some of these countries that are being quite critical of the ETS2. And then maybe just on the social climate fund, I mean, what we also see is that the social climate plans and the planning there is being done in part by different ministries or entities than the implementation of the ETS2. So I'm not surprised that perhaps there's also a disconnect in what's being planned through the social climate fund and perhaps a bit of enthusiasm that's happening there, and what the discussion is on the ETS2. And of course, yes, those funds will fall away, but the social climate plans are also supposed to be additional, right? And the measures there are supposed to be additional. So yeah, we recently had the election in the Czech Republic, right? And we have another election period coming up. I think that's the case for a lot of countries where the question of cost of living, energy costs is really prevalent and part of the political debate.
And I think if I allow to add my 2 cents to that discussion, that what we have to ensure as experts working in that area, especially on the national level, is to show again that ETS2 is a system which is creating revenues, additional money, which is very much needed for the decarbonization of heating and or building and road transport sector, which anyway has to happen, because even without ETS2, we still have effort sharing regulation, which also applies to those 2 sectors. So I feel so we have to have stronger communication on that. Actually, this system or market-based instrument is helping us to generate more money on that, and that's something I think we have to take into discussion. And that's for the one people, the government, and I think for the citizens to accept this instrument is actually that what Alex have put into the study, with more transparency, more governmental body. It's not a clear fund where you really can see the money is going there and the money is spent for or on this and that. So that's, I think, very important in that regard. And I don't know, Cornelia, do we have further questions from chat? Because otherwise I will address one other questions, or maybe Aleksander, you want
Maybe I'll just add, once again, it's needed to be a bit creative. So I don't want to discuss all the ETS2 reform proposals, but some of them include some kind of, you can say, derogation or some special treatment for some fuels or for some countries. And then you usually would ask, okay, what are conditions for getting this special treatment? And then once again, we come back to the issue of additional safeguards for recycling revenues, additional safeguards for making sure that the money are actually reinvested. So I think that this is also a kind of important point, that saying that, oh, we don't need additional safeguards because we have 100% ETS directive provision. In practice, it's not enough. So you can expect to say, okay, we would like to have additional safeguards regarding how you spend the money in exchange for any flexibilities if they are needed. But let's discuss this in another day, maybe.
Yes, clearly a topic which leads to, which is clearly connected to the other topics. So we need like a whole day discussion actually to pick up all the parts of this interesting discussion. I had one more question to you, because that was very interesting what you, Victoria, said when Aleksander mentioned the Climate and Transformation Fund in Germany as this good example for having a one dedicated fund for the revenues from ETS1, ETS2, or in Germany from the national CO2 price system, going into that. And you were like, oh, okay, actually that could be a good thing. It could be seen like a good thing. And on the other hand, you mentioned, Aleksander, that it's like a general recommendation for the other countries, and you mean like Poland is like one step before implementing this. So maybe one question to Aleksander: what was actually the reason why it didn't happen in Poland so far? Because you mentioned also in the report that there was one time when one of the governmental body could govern the money spent on, but it was one time and it didn't happen again. And maybe to you, Victoria, are there any things which we can learn from Germany on Climate and Transformation Fund, where you said, okay, if the other countries should have such a dedicated fund, that's the experience we have, we did with the fund we have, and we can share some practice or good practice or examples for other countries to avoid that. So who wants to start first?
Maybe I'll just answer about the Polish fund. So it's always a bit difficult to have this kind of clarity, what actually happened and why it happened, because there's connection we talked about in this Ministry of Energy, Climate, and so on. There is also Ministry of Finance, which for good reasons has its own duties to ensure that there is balance and efficiency and effectiveness of revenues and spending. But I think that it's very likely that it was an issue of COVID crisis, and then afterwards war and all the increased spending. So today in Poland, we actually have a quite difficult fiscal situation when it comes to amount of spending versus how much we get the revenues. So it comes back to my comment on the timing. So if you have a new source of revenues, it appears in the budget, and you have some fiscal space. If you earmark it, then it stays because it kind of enters the administrations in the following years. If you don't, you miss the moment because, for instance, in this year, something happened like COVID, repayment of loans or whatever. It's very risky, like there's a high risk that it's already kind of internalized by the Ministry of Finance, but it's okay, it's part of general revenues, so be it. So it's actually quite a long debate about the practicalities, theoretical rules of budgetary efficiency and so on. I think in practice, in the end, it is useful to have an informed decision about earmarking and transparency for these large chunks of money. And this is also why we think that, for instance, the German example is a useful one when you have a general decision that this goes for climate, and then you can fine-tune what exactly are you going to do with these funds. But you have this moment when you say, okay, this flow goes into the climate pot.
Yeah, and I think and definitely just having a climate pot makes a huge difference in how it's perceived as well, because it is something that's quite well known in the public in Germany, and people see it as a very good thing and something that's not kind of in danger really of going away. So it has a certain stability to it as well, and is sort of known from the public. I think, I mean, there's a couple of things we can learn from the KTF. I mean, it's not meant just for EU revenue use, right? So there's a lot of different funding that goes in there. On the one hand, that also makes sense because it means we have different funds that we use to fund climate change, and we don't just want to use ETS revenues. But there's that over-reporting issue, and there's no way of differentiating where money is going to, and that does decrease transparency. I'm not sure it's a huge issue because I'm not sure people or the discussion in the general public is not so much like, oh, is it what's being done with the ETS revenues? We don't know where they're going or what's happening. We just know it's part of the big pot and we like the big pot kind of thing. So there's a trade-off between what's practical, what's already in place, and what we do for transparency and visibility. I think there has, however, been some back and forth in the funding of the KTF. It's also mentioned in the report that the funds were in danger of being depleted in 2025. We tried to get money from loan guarantees to go into the KTF. That was considered unconstitutional. Funding was stopped for 2 months, I think. So it generated a little bit of discussion around what are we spending money on there? Where is the money going? Where do we keep getting money from for the KTF? And it was only because of the additional money that was through the Sondervermögen that was decided by the new government at the beginning of the year, where the Greens, an oppositional party, made a bid for money to also go into the KTF, that we now have a more kind of stable financing mechanism there, I think through to 2029. So just because we have the KTF doesn't immediately mean that there's a lot of funding stability, but there's a continued negotiation that goes on there, and it feels a little bit like a political fight for the KTF as well. What's being prioritized in terms of the spending, but it's a good leverage, I think, to ensure that climate spending isn't being completely removed from the budget in an easy way. Maybe finally, because there's a lot of different ministries that have access to the KTF and that can distribute funds from it, I think the majority of it comes from the Wirtschaftsministerium, the economic ministry, not the finance ministry. When in the previous legislation it was the economic and climate ministry, we had a very strong focus on climate activities. Now it's the climate has moved back into a different ministry, and now energy is there. So I think there's a politics to these to what the money is being used for and what the ministry's priorities are. And it will be interesting to see what the spending is like in this next legislative period, if we see a focus more kind of on energy aspects, kind of in quotation marks, rather than climate aspects, whatever that delineation may look like. Yeah, so maybe that's just some comments that even if you have the fund, good to keep an eye on it.
Maybe just one quick comment on that. Once again, not getting into all the details of political discussion, but rather even like we shouldn't be afraid of political discussions if they're transparent. So even looking outside of the German case, it's very useful to have to see directly, oh, there is a kind of provision which says that you can use it for a semiconductor factory because it's voted in and there was a discussion and there was a decision. Okay, not perfect from the climate point of view, but at least transparent, and you have it on. It's a decision which you can see, which is not the case in many other places. So once again, this is also a kind of space for having this kind of discussion and having predictability in the end, that you will have a discussion about how to spend or not spend. It's not the case because sometimes you just run out of money in the program suddenly, and then you don't have any space for a few months or a few years to continue a program, which is not perfect, of course.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both of you, and also for showing us this, different aspect of having a dedicated fund and some political discussion going around them. But yeah, don't feel discouraged. That's what I think from what I took from what Alex just said. And we are already a little bit over the time, so I would like to directly pass to my colleague Anna Muller from the organization Zero for some closing remarks. But already, thank you very much from my side.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you to the speakers for being here. I just want to, before we close, ask you to answer the survey that I'm sharing in the chat. It's a survey about the organization of these kind of webinars so we can improve in the future. It was very interesting discussion that we had here. I would like to thank everyone involved in the Life Effect project, as well as Reform Institute for making the execution and dissemination of this study possible. Their incredible work.
I think that we need to have an access to the survey.
Oh, maybe, okay, sorry. I will change right away the the specs. I just wanted to say to focus on the incredible work and commitment to just and effective carbon pricing policies that are fundamental, important for the successful implementation of ETS2. Thank you everyone for being here. I will change the specs for the survey right away and see you all next time in the next ETS talk that will probably happen in January. Thank you everyone.
And thank you to Aneta Stefancic for answering also the questions in the chat. So thank you very much for that. It was a great support for us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you to all of you. And bye-bye.